Welcome to the Radical Therapist. This is your host, Chris Hoff, and we are now at episode number 86. And this is a special one, friends, because I have a previous guest. This is a return guest, which hasn't happened that many times here on the Radical Therapist. But today, Justine D'Arrigo will be joining me, and we're going to be talking about a project we did together that is coming out in a book emerging project with Thick Press. By the time you listen to this, it might even be out. I'm not exactly sure, but we're really excited about it. It's a book emerging project with Thick Press, and the title of the project is Beyond Critique, Composition and Curiosity in Therapy. And this is a project where Justine and I have kind of, written down some of the things that we've been thinking and talking about for the last couple of years. And we didn't really want to do it. We're kind of subverting the academic journal process in this. And Thick Press, Aaron and Julie of Thick Press have just been amazing about inviting us to do this project and putting it out. And it's going to be coming out at kind of the release, I think, is really at the end of the month, or February 25th and 28th at Printed Matter's Virtual Art Book Fair. And if you're not familiar with Printed Matter, they're in New York, and they've done fairs since about 2005. And so Printed Matter's Art book fairs have hosted international exhibitors featuring a wide variety of published works, from zines to artist books to rare and out-of-print publications and contemporary art editions. And they are going to be hosting a virtual art book fair on February 25th through 28th. And Justine and I and Julie and Aaron are actually going to do a Facebook Live on the Radical Therapist Facebook page, so look out for that. That'll be announcing here shortly. But this fair kind of brings together the New York and LA art book fair communities, and also expands it beyond that, of course, because it is virtual now. So for those of you that are really into art book fairs like I am, you might want to check that out. That's when our book's going to be released. So we're really excited about this project. And so I have Justine D'Arrigo with me, to my writing partner, my longtime writing partner. We've published a couple of things through the kind of the traditional routes, the academic journal stuff together. But for those of you that don't know Justine D'Arrigo is counseling faculty at Cal State University, San Bernardino, my writing partner, and just, my confidant in a lot of ways too. So hi, Justine. Glad
Hi. Yeah, hi. Good to be back on the Radical Therapist.
Yeah, awesome. So we get to talk today. We have this interesting dilemma of getting to talk about our own work, and so I thought I would start by, one more time, everybody. The title of our project is Beyond Critique, Composition and Curiosity in Therapy, and so we start this work that's going to be coming out by making the claim that contemporary family therapy and counseling fields are at a crossroads, right? And if we are to remain impactful in these contemporary times, it is necessary for us to take a critical look at the tools, ideas, and beliefs that have shaped and governed our work. While the world we live in is struggling with new fundamentalisms in both domestic and global politics, we are witness to and cannot deny the influence of these larger contexts on the intimate conversations we have with those who seek our help. At the time of this writing, many in the field are wrestling with how to integrate social justice into therapy and counseling in tangible and explicit ways, which we've written about in the past. And the more and more therapists are understanding that therapy is bigger than what happens in the four walls of most therapy offices, and are engaged in an effort to confront these systemic problems in the larger social context. In this effort, helpers are increasingly relying on critique and deconstruction, tools that have a long history and more post-structural ways of working. And we believe that these tools have become largely distributed across ideologies. For example, I read an article recently where they called President Trump the first postmodern president, right?
Oof.
Yeah. Well, and we are kind of critiquing these tools now. Are they the tools that are going to take us into the future, or have they kind of been lost across ideologies now? I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, on our initial claim.
Yeah, if I have any thoughts on that,
Sure, yeah.
read my book. No, I'm just kidding. Read our book. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think you bring up a good point about Trump being referred to as the first postmodern president. And I think that should sort of like alert people's ears to the fact that like maybe something has gone awry here, right? Sort of the tool of deconstruction, the intent of it, how it has been like Latour talks about how it's become a virus that's been let loose out of the lab.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Which is a good analogy in our days of pandemic. Yeah.
Right. It might be a little bit too apt right now for all of us. Right.
Right.
But right. So this, what sort of thing, something that has started with a good intention has mutated and been taken up in ways that now are sort of like, like I love how Latour talks about like ruins upon ruins, right? Like wars, so many wars. When he opens in that article, that's like the perfect way to capture this sentiment, I think. And I think he speaks about it in terms of us being intellectuals, right? So like as scholars and intellectuals, should we be at war also? And I think you and I have sort of brought that into the field of therapy, where as therapists, should we be at war? Right? As therapists, should we be contributing ruins to ruins? And so I think that's how you, me, us together have kind of come to this work of like wanting to pause and be like, what's happening here?
Right.
Yeah.
No, and that's great. You have me thinking about, and for the listeners, maybe we're thinking about when we say Trump being a postmodern president, he was one who started to he started to attack facts, right? Or truth, or these kinds of things, which, if we were honest with ourselves, came out of what would be characterized as the left, maybe, or some of these taking on taken for granted assumptions. And you saw how this mutated. It got out of the lab, so to speak, as Latour talks about. And we're talking about Bruno Latour's seminal piece of work called "Has Critique Lost Steam?" Or
why is critique run out of steam?
Yeah, right. So that's been very influential on both of us. So. So continuing on, I was going to think something, but I forgot what it was. But we titled this work Beyond Critique, but we also write about going beyond deconstruction. And in our work, we claim everybody is a deconstructionist now, right? And Latour argues that if critique is going to be relevant again, it will be found in the cultivation of a stubbornly realist attitude, or rather a second empiricism dealing with what Latour calls matters of concern rather than matters of fact. And that, we're seeing we've lost the matters of fact. And so how do we maybe pivot a little bit to matters of concern? But about experience or events which get derailed by politics or ideology. Do you have any thoughts about this? I know you've talked about how deconstruction has escaped the lab.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so what resonates for me in Latour's work, and we've talked about this a lot, which it might seem paradoxical, actually, because you and I come from, we sort of situate ourselves coming from more post-structural, postmodern approaches to therapy, right?
Yeah, right.
And even in our writing, we do that as well. And I think maybe the paradox I'm thinking is that I think oftentimes how people consume post-structuralism is that it is about getting us away from facts, right? Or like it's about, we should always be deconstructing or suspicious of facts.
Right.
And I think that what resonates for me in Latour's work that you and I have sort of like chewed on a bit is that it's actually not about getting away from facts, right? It's about how do we get closer to them. So it's almost like we don't want to fight empiricism, like we kind of like want to renew empiricism. And I think that's going to like put us in a whole different conversation as well about, how do we get close to matters of concern. But those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Guide me back. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, everybody's a deconstructionist now. One of the things that we've been
Yeah.
talking about is that, and I think everybody listening can realize, like, everybody's really good at critique, right? And ultimately what this project is about is how do we move from critique to composition, and that everybody's good at, like, I mean, look at your Instagram feed now or whatever. Everybody's good at taking down things, but nobody, do you see anybody that's being able to compose and
That's right.
compose with more than just their group of whatever pure ideological belief systems, right? And if you're not inside that, people don't know how to compose with the collective, then maybe with the individual, but we get stuck in that individualistic thing. So that's one of the things we're talking about. Like, everybody's gotten good at critique, and I'm guilty of it as well, right? I like critiquing things, but now my challenge has always been, like, how along with maybe a critique, what's the composition, right? Okay,
Chris, can I say something about that real fast? I'm just thinking how, right, we were trained to do this in our PhD program, right? This is sort of like we've used education as, like, the vehicle to support, like, we need to teach students how to have a critical mind. We need to teach therapists how to have a critical mind. But then what gets left in its wake, right? So we take apart, we all of these sort of constructions or experiences are now, we deconstruct them to now where they're left in pieces, but then how do we recompose those back together? That's the part we haven't always done, right? Like, nobody thinks about that.
No, and now, and you see, like you said, now these tools, tools of critique, like Latour would say, have escaped the lab, and now everybody's using them. So now you see what we have. We have this very divisive, and some of it's, I don't want to discount systems of oppression, those kinds of things, and that they shouldn't be critiqued. That's not what I'm saying, but there's just, everybody has one move, and that's just critique, right? And so we're maybe making encouraging, or trying to maybe make possible some more moves, right? That move, like Latour said, that move of critique is only taken us so far. Now it's just, like you said, ruins upon ruins. We're just building ruins.
Right. And I was reviewing some of Latour's writing, and it makes sense to me, the seduction of critique, right? So he talks about how, right, why does it feel so good to have a critical mind? Well, it's because you're always in the position of being right.
Exactly.
Right. You have the better, your finger is on the pulse of, like, the projections people are making about the things that they're saying are facts, right? And you're able to see it, and they're not. But now everybody has this tool of critique. So from all sides, everyone is doing the same thing, which just leaves us stuck.
Everyone's running around being right.
Exactly.
And so
we're not building anything.
No, and nobody wants to risk not knowing. Well, which we're going to get to.
We're going to get there.
That leads us into my next kind of thought, and that was that for us, one of the primary casualties of all of this, and this is the piece for all the listeners that we kind of wanted to get at, and this is the curiosity piece of the writing that we did, but because we make the claim that one of the primary casualties of this contemporary way of working, that what's happening with critique and all of that, has been curiosity. And maybe this is where we talk about the instance, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what we think is getting in the way of curiosity.
Well, you're really the one that kind of put the structure around how Latour uses this idea of the instance, and then how that comes into our work. But I think you and I've talked a lot about how curiosity really gets sidelined by the ways that we're taught to come to conclusions so fast, right? About anything, like whether that's like in psychology, making really quick assessments about what someone's pathology is, right? How do you be curious from that place? You can't, right? You're like so focused on putting to use your expert knowledge And when that is front and center, how curious are we being about the client, like the client's experience, right? And this gets refashioned, that instant process, right? So the instant psychoanalysis that you and I call that, right? Or the instant psychology, that becomes instant sociology, becomes instant revisionism.
Yeah.
And so we're so focused on doing things quickly and putting to use our expert knowledge that curiosity is just sort of an afterthought, or it's there to confirm.
Yeah, and I think this is what hashtag hot take is doing to our field, right? And so in the paper for the listeners and in the work, the book Emerging Work, we lay out our kind of three, what we call the instants, and it's instant psychology, instant sociology, and then instant revisionism, all primarily borrowed from Bruno Latour's work. And instant psychology is that, just kind of slapping a category on a person, this person is fill in the blank diagnosis or whatever, and then we totalize and lose the person behind systems of categorization, right? And then but what's something we've both been concerned about, and I think this is an important piece, and this is where, this is the piece that probably will get us canceled.
Most definitely.
Yeah, but this is where, we're seeing it now in social justice efforts, right? Where now there's like an expertise on what gets named as the system of oppression or the problem, or this larger social context problem. You're seeing the same kind of expert knowledge showing up, and this kind of structural way of thinking, this kind of binary way of thinking. It's interesting. You're seeing people who work from really post-structural places moving into more structural definitions of people when they start talking about social justice stuff. And but also they start determining what problems are, right? They're doing the same kind of thing that people might have done with the DSM before. Now they're doing it with social justice problems. And we call it, people are beginning to colonize other people, but they're doing it from a countercultural perspective, right?
Yeah. And we've written about that before, right? That somehow, like for our conscience, that feels more okay to do, right? Like when we're engaged in a potential process of colonization, but if we're doing it, when we're doing it, attuning to experiences and systemic injustice, it's less bad than when we're doing it in a way that supports traditional or modern psychology, right? Or Western psychology.
Right.
But there's still, right. And I think that's where you and I have really wanted to hold our work accountable. To say, should we be thinking about, right? Even if it supports what we're labeling as social justice efforts in therapy, is there also an edge to this that we should sort of be more cautious and tentative with? Like, are there unintended consequences when we define someone's experience as falling within a realm of a particular systemic issue or cultural issue that's, has to do with oppression and power?
Absolutely.
And I think probably for you and I, because we are white therapists, there is even an additional layer for us of wanting to be mindful of, like, do we really have the power to name that for clients, particularly clients who are clients of color or different experiences, right? But yet we are seeing this. We are all doing this so quickly. It's the instant understanding of problems in a context that labels them as like, these are injustice issues, right? Or we define that a person's being oppressed, but maybe they don't feel oppressed.
maybe that's not their experience.
That's not their definition of what's happening.
And then we feel like we need to correct their understanding of their own experience,
right?
We need to enlighten them.
Right. So that's where we get into the socio-education, right? Which is the social justice part. It's the social justice counterpart to psychoeducation.
Absolutely. And our final instant is instant revisionism, which I think is, you're seeing more and more now, because everybody has to have, this is the hashtag hot take, right? Everybody has to have kind of a hot take about when an event happens, to go back in time based on a particular ideology or belief or particular view, and then recreate that experience or narrate that experience through that particular lens. And this is another thing that we have to, as especially as therapists, when we're going back in time with clients, how do we not and I don't know if we have an answer for this, quite honestly, but
I hope we don't.
yeah, right. But it is something we want to pay attention to, right? And it's like, what are we taking back with us? What kind of lenses are we, and how are we revising particular events based on ideology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you see it happen, like, say, the Capitol insurrection, for example, depending upon where people are placed, you get to see how that thing gets narrated, right? That would be an example.
Yeah. I think we've lived through instant revisionism. I mean, certainly for the last 4 years, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and this is where, dependent upon agenda, right? And this is how things get narrated, or the story gets told, or how meaning making gets done, right? Yeah. Okay, so just for our readers, much of, where are we getting these ideas, or how have we been influenced, or where are these ideas coming from? So much of our approach is influenced by two seminal papers written by philosopher and social scientist Bruno Latour, who's French. Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam, 2004, and a Compositionist Manifesto, 2010. If you haven't read those, I highly recommend them. You can get them, just Google them and they'll be out there, and you don't have to get through a paywall or anything like that. And also, we were profoundly influenced by Dr. Anna Louise Keating's work, Transformation Now Toward a Post-Oppositional Politics of Change. And maybe I was hoping you could say something about how these works have influenced you and us, and like, why are they so important to us?
Yeah. Well, I think part of their importance has been, I mean, you and I love curiosity, right? We sort of like we want to reinvigorate curiosity, and we want to bring that back to be like a real central part of the work. And like the real kind of curiosity. And I shouldn't say it that way, but right. Like not the feigned curiosity, because we're supposed to ask questions as therapists. Right. But because we really don't know, and because we're really trying to construct and create with questions. And I think that's why these works have been so important. I mean, I could say a lot, but I think, when Latour is talking about why critique was used in the first place, it was because there was an assumption of a world we were trying to get to. And he would say that world doesn't really exist, right? Like, when we compose a world, we're composing something that we don't even know yet, right? It's not a thing we're trying to find. And I think like Anna Louise Keating's work puts us in that ballpark as well, of post-oppositionality, holding space for the both and, is a really unknown, tentative, always in flux, liminal kind of experience, right? So I think there's a lot of overlap between composition and post-oppositionality, that it's sort of we can't know ahead of time exactly where we're headed. I mean, that's like the antithesis of the work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we've been talking about tools not working, and Latour asks if we can devise another powerful descriptive tool that deals with matters of concern and whose important task will be not to debunk, but to protect and care. So the question that directs our efforts is, how do we move from an individual experience to a collective adventure? And I'm wondering if we could say more about this.
Yes. Well, I mean, you might say this too. It's like, I don't totally know. I think that it's possible, right? Like, you and I live in the space that it's possible.
Yep.
But we figure it out as we go.
Yeah. And I think, it's that, like, how do we switch from or move from like that safe critique place, where you get to always be right, and to protecting and caring for ideas, projects, possibilities, and protect and care for them together in the face of, being accused of being sentimental or naive or all of these kinds of things. And this isn't about,
That's
some
right.
utopian vision, like we're going to get to some,
That's right.
there's no endpoint to this, right? We don't have a vision of an endpoint, but how do we collectively moved, and this is the interesting piece to me, because we have become so individualized in various ways, like the hashtag do you boo. Right? So, that's just like,
Right.
just that, if it doesn't serve you, don't deal with it, which is in a lot of cases can be helpful for people. But if we're going to embark on a new collective adventure, that's, we're going to have to be uncomfortable together, and we're going to have to and how do we create tools that support stepping into that kind of liminal space?
Yeah, I'm just thinking how there is like a really precarious blurring of some things that maybe are helpful for us, but then we can't, like I'm thinking about the you do you boo, right? Where it's like anything that doesn't serve you, like you're justified to make a boundary with that, right? And that's okay if that's what you need to do for yourself. And it's like, yeah, right, in some instances, in some cases, in some contexts. But I think there's this like there's sort of like this mass application to like all parts of our experience of that same principle. And I think that that's like not complex enough. That's not nuanced enough.
Yeah, and I think it's been hijacked by that individualistic ethic,
Right?
And it has rendered us in a lot of ways unable to have hard conversations, to be uncomfortable, to, and I think this is where Sarah Schulman's work, conflict is not abuse, like that, but like how people kind of, she makes a claim people overstate harm and in harmful ways that shut down conversations and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, you're right. But I think like you're so right? Like thinking about this move from an individual to a collective adventure. I mean, that's like the question of all time, right? Like how do we get back to a collective sense of our responsibility to one another?
Right.
Oof, in the United States, that's a tall order. Possible. I think you and I live in the realm where that is possible. But I don't know, Chris, what you would say about this, and this might be a conversation for a totally different time, but like Latour has a lot of like spiritual threads in what he writes, right? And that, like, he talks about God, right? Whatever that is. And I think that that's also part of it, is that there's like the spiritual, and I think of that as like being in a position of a seeker, right? You don't always know what is like sort of like at the next door, right? So are we all willing to go to that unknown liminal space together? Like what you said, are we willing to be uncomfortable and to not have the answer? And this probably all sounds like I'm reducing it down to something really simple, but I think those are really hard things, right?
No, and I think you had me thinking about, like, in Zen, we talk about great faith and great doubt, right? Running alongside each other, that,
That's
great doubt that anything's going to happen with this, right? And then great faith that we will be okay, that we'll get somewhere, right? And I think that's a lot of our work. How do we hold tensions, right? And I hear you talk about that a lot. Like, how do we hold a lot of this tension together and move forward? So
yeah, that there won't be resolution to it, and in fact that's a good thing.
Okay, let's talk about Dr. Anna Louise Keating's work around post-oppositional politics of change. Dr. Keating, takes the position that we live in a larger culture of oppositionism, and she wrote this book, I think, in 2012. And I mean, look at us now, right?
Jeez.
that what becomes normative or right within culture is determined by beating down or stamping out various other alternatives, that an oppositional culture creates norms and values through domination. Keating goes on to describe how in this mental framework of opposition, we destroy the possibility for the both and to survive as a necessary tension. When we do this, we leave few opportunities for other considerations or possibilities that stand outside of normative judgment. I mean, what are your thoughts on post-oppositionality and how it influences our work?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. The book was written in 2012. It was kind of prophetic, right?
Yeah, right.
Unfortunately, yeah. Um, I think how I have taken this idea of post oppositionality that she writes about, sort of in as a counseling and therapist educator, and a person trained as a therapist myself. And I would say, like, you and I are probably similar in this, but I want Anna Louise Keating would talk about how, like, there's this desire to be entirely inclusive, right? So, like, we want to seek to create the complex commonalities rather than reduce them. It's kind of like we want to breathe life into those places, places where, we can acknowledge sort of paradox and contradiction and multiplicity. And I think sometimes the like how that shifts the work is that oftentimes people maybe are seeking help or support to help reduce contradiction, or complexities, right? We all maybe could really think that we would thrive from some more simplicity in our lives. But that maybe our work as therapists as well is to kind of get really curious about what grows from those places of paradox and contradiction, right? So to not resolve them, but to see what they create. Those are some of my initial thoughts about, like, this post-oppositional, like the both and. That's a really simple way to describe it. Mm-hmm. And if you live it, that's hard, right? Both and is super hard. Yeah.
Well, and I think, Dr. Keating does draw on Gloria Anzaldua's work around the Napantalara and this figure that kind of doesn't attach to any kind of particular movement, or just a person that can navigate all the in-between spaces, right? And not particularly inhabiting them fully. And I always use that as a model for so hard to do, but a model for how the skills we're probably going to need as we embark on the future, right?
Yeah, it's the Gloria Anzaldúa uses that image of the bridge that we're standing on, is we're continually taking it apart and building it as we're walking across it, right? So that's like to me, it's like a real visual imagery of liminal space. And then Napantalara just lives there, right? And has has ease there, right? That's a place where there's actually, like, some, I don't know if I want to use the word energy, comfort, but maybe, or there's energy, right? There's life there. There's life there rather than just absolute terror, right? That we can actually be on that bridge, and we can not know where it goes, or if we'll have a foothold in the next step, but, like, we are creating that.
Okay, so last question. So we're making the case for a compositionist approach, and I guess for our listeners, what is our compositionist approach?
Compositionist approach.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to borrow from Latour.
Okay.
Because I think, right, his whole idea around compositionism is that it's tentative and precautionary progression, right? So I think, like, to me, that's sort of like an anchor in what it means to take this compositionist approach. And I mean, you could speak more to this too, but I think, like, what a compositionist approach is, he talks about how the critic is not the one who debunks, but the critic is one who assembles.
Yeah.
And so I think um, we he yeah I think being a compositionist therapist, maybe that's going to be a thing that we're going to say in years to come. Right. um but like we're creating spaces, he would call them like arenas where we gather, right, where we gather the things. um and I think when I'm imagining myself in a space of compositionality, or composing in the context with a client, I think part of what you and I presented on in Vancouver was this idea of like, we're going to ask questions that intentionally situate what oftentimes we might think are contradictory things. We're going to intentionally put those together in how we construct a question. Um, and so some of the examples from that are like, right, like we've talked about, what's an example off the top of my head? Like in our culture, we don't really value people who hear voices, right? Like we have a certain connotation to what we think that what kind of experience that creates for them. And oftentimes traditional psychology approaches would see that as really standing against someone's sanity, right? So if they're hearing voices.
Yeah.
But I think a compositionist approach can be, how, like, what do those voices teach you about remaining sane?
Right.
Right. And like, I think intentionally asking questions that people would often think like these two experiences are sort of like um, polarized from one another, like don't fit together. That's just one way I think of visioning how to do this work. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about that too. And I don't want to settle on anything or try to fix it, but I think
For
there's
sure.
some things that can help. And, for our listeners, like what would a composition approach look at? I think I like Michael White wrote once, and I don't think he really, unfortunately, finished up on that, but he said it was important to engage in some predictions of experiences that are to be had in liminal phase. And I don't think he
That's
ever,
beautiful.
kind of came up
Yeah.
with maps for that. But I think, there is ways we can begin to map the driving forces that are going to be at play in these new kinds of ways of being. That there's a school of that I've become interested in lately that I hope to recruit Justine into writing with me about it, around future scenarios that's being used in climate science right now, that but was born out of street theater and improvisation and stuff, and how kind of creating future scenarios can help guide people into liminal space and have conversations about what they might expect as they try to do this collective adventure together, like a street theater performance. And if you're not familiar, street theater, people would be presented with some sort of scenario, right? Like, and then they had to play it out in the moment. And I think there's, from those kinds of expertise or just knowledge, we can learn a lot, right? About how to help people kind of come together and perform something, compose something in the moment. So
Yeah, I appreciate that you're speaking to that layer too of what we have held as important in some of our ideas about compositionism is, and the word you used was improvisation. I think that that's so on point. Because you and I have had this experience of people are like, so what is it? Like, what is a compositionist approach? And we joke, like, I think we did this in Vancouver. We're like, we don't fucking know. I don't know if I can say that on your podcast.
it's okay. Yeah.
Right. But we don't know. Right. Like, so we're not saying like that, like this is now our new structure, our new formula for kind of this like new era of approaching therapy. We're just playing with ideas, right? And we're resonating with ideas, and we're curious and wondering how this shapes us, how this shapes our work, how this might shape the experience for clients, right? But
Yeah. And in some ways, I think it's on purpose because, people want to reduce things down so
That's
they
right.
can bring the critical tools at play.
Right.
And we don't want to fall into your trap. So,
Right. Right. We're intentionally not going to define it so
yeah,
that you can't deconstruct it.
exactly. We're gonna play that game with you. So,
Right.
okay.
Right.
Uh, any final thoughts? Um,
My final thoughts are that this is just like this is a dot dot dot.
yeah.
Yeah. Like and hopefully some of these ideas are exciting to people and they check out our little WordPress booklet. And,
Yeah.
um,
Um, yeah. So, listeners, if you made it this far, thank you for listening. And just a reminder, all this work that and much more is coming out in a book emerging project with Thick Press, and will be featured at the Printed Matter Virtual Art Book Fair on the weekend of February 25th through 28th on 20 this month. And we will, like I said, we will be doing a Facebook Live at the Radical Therapist Facebook page. So if you're not a friend of the Facebook page, go do that, and you'll be able to get caught up on the announcements there. If you want to order this, I think it's fairly cheap. I think it's going to be under $10. This
mhm.
our book emerging project. You could just go to Thick Press, ThickPress.com, and shoot them an email, or it's going to be up on their website pretty soon, probably in the next. I don't know when this is coming out, but soon. So keep an eye out for that, and you can get a unique copy. It's an art book with these ideas all in it, and wait till you see it. We're really, really proud of it, and it's going to be fun and unique, and it might even you consider it an art object that you're going to want to take a look at. So okay, so thank you everybody for listening, and please come find the Radical Therapist on all our social media if you want to be updated about all the stuff that's coming up this month regarding this project. You can find us on Instagram at the Radical Therapist, on Twitter at the Rad Therapist, Facebook, of course. And if you have any questions, email me at the radicaltherapist@gmail.com. How can people find you, Justine? How would they reach out to you?
Yeah, they can reach me through the Cal State San Bernardino website, which is just csusb.edu. And you can type in my name, Justine D'Arrigo, and it'll take you to a place where all my info is there for you. So email address and all that good stuff if anyone is interested in having further conversation. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, everybody. Thank you again for listening. My name is Chris Hoff. This has been another episode of The Radical Therapist. And as always, thanks for listening.